I always wanted to play Final Fantasy XVI, but it was on the PS5 last year when it came out, and unfortunately, I don't have a PS5. There's other PS5 exclusives I still want to play, like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Stellar Blade, and Astrobot, just to name a few. Thankfully, or at least it seems like, that these PS5 exclusives are slowly being ported to PC, and Final Fantasy XVI was officially released on PC about like a couple of weeks ago, and of course, I was there day one when it was released. Knowing literally nothing other than like an hour of watching someone play a part of the demo like last year, I went in knowing absolutely nothing about the content of the game. And honestly, it was one hell of an experience that I was glad I had no prior knowledge of. And since I think knowing nothing of the surprises and twists, I won't be going in depth or in detail of any sort of spoilers. And all footage is from the first 2 hours of the game. And even though this game is probably one of the best experiences I've ever had with a video game, there are still obvious flaws with the game that doesn't make it an enjoyable all-around experience. I think the best way to describe the story is that it's a roller coaster in a roller coaster. The story has its ups and downs. The pacing with the story is one thing I really hated. The slow parts are really slow. They're essentially fillers, and given the context of what happened prior to the mission, it makes virtually no sense in why Clive, the main character, would even do something like this. For example, you could be fighting on, I don't know, the reincarnation of Zeus, I'm exaggerating here, in an epic fight on top of Mount Olympus, and you barely defeat him, then immediately after, the main quest is to save a lost cat from being stuck on top of a tree. And that alone takes up to 45 minutes of your time. I understand that after big fights, you need to slow down the pacing to let like people breathe and then ramp it back up to the next major story beat. But as a main quest, I expected something to be still very relevant to the main story and still build upon themes, world, lore, or even like develop characters that are close to Clive. But unfortunately, when saving cats from the treetops are those quests, it does nothing to build upon the story and instead wastes the player's time. Going back to the roller coaster and roller coaster analogy, when it gets to its high points, it gets pretty crazy. These usually include like icon fights in some sort of way, which ends up being like a very big cinematic boss fight, and they are amazing. These fights can take up to like 30 minutes, but they feel like 10 minutes within these high points of the roller coasters where like the real roller coaster is, and it just gets crazy. I'll touch upon this a bit later. A lot of people have compared this to Game of Thrones, and even though I never watched that show myself, I can kinda see what they mean. You think of JRPGs, and you think of uwu anime sword fighters with cat ears saving their waifus and femboys. But even as a JRPG, this game is meant to try to portray like a medieval western theme with a very dark tone. It's very apparent, especially in the demo. It's bloody, it's gruesome, it's mature, and no one is safe. Even chocobos are not safe from the horrors of war. The story is centered around and pretty much Clive only. Now that doesn't mean the other characters are not interesting, but everything is clearly through the lens of Clive, and Clive is a great character. And even his sidekicks like Jill, Torgal, and Sid are still great characters. They just don't get like the same spotlight that Clive gets throughout the story, if that makes sense. And the graphics for the games is insane. I don't know how to describe it. There will be times where you will just stare at the vistas or in certain sections of the boss fights in awe. Then there will be times where you see something and you just sit there and just ask yourself, what the heck you just witnessed out loud? Before I get into the actual gameplay mechanics, I think it's very important to say that this game follows a more traditional adventure game than a traditional RPG. Although the world of Valisthea is very diverse and big, this is not like Final Fantasy XV's open world style. Final Fantasy XVI is a linear game. Also, in most traditional RPGs, especially for Final Fantasy games, it centers around a party of characters. An obvious good example of this is Final Fantasy VII. Each character has a skill tree, stats, and abilities that are uniquely different from each other. Whereas in Final Fantasy XVI, it's very centralized around Clive and Clive only. The skill tree is only available to Clive and not to party members such as like Sid or Torgal. I'll touch on this a bit more later, but I find this more suited as an adventure game rather than a traditional RPG. But don't be surprised if you have a feeling that it's not mechanically like other Final Fantasy games, because it really isn't. And it doesn't really bother me too much because look, there's a lot of Final Fantasy games, and when you're 15 iterations into the series, you have to make sure that each iteration is unique in its own way. So playing through this game through the lens of an adventure game, it was very refreshing. And even though I've only played like 3 Final Fantasy games, hey, look, I'm pretty young. Half of them were released before I was even born. I have played a lot of other traditional JRPGs. And I guess one of the main issues I think Final Fantasy veterans would have with Final Fantasy XVI is that it may not feel like a Final Fantasy game. At least for me, it definitely feels like one. It just had an emphasis on more cinematography and the gods of the Final Fantasy lore. As someone who isn't a lore god on Final Fantasy, I definitely walked away with more knowledge, especially with like the gods present in the Final Fantasy world. And so even as a more like adventure-centered genre game, I still think it's a good and appropriate entry into the series. Combat is visually really good, but to get to the point of proper full power, it can take a while to reach to that point. You have your basic light attack, basic magic attack, but the main source of your damage is going to be your abilities that you get from various icons. You start with the Blessings from the Phoenix, and you're able to do like Rising Flames, which is a cool flaming uppercut that does a good amount of damage and just visually looks cool. You can have up to 3 different icons equipped with 2 different abilities within each icon. Problem is that you get that 3rd icon maybe like 10 hours in, and so that first 10 hours your overall damage output doesn't feel great and clearly feels like you're missing something. But then every icon after that 3rd one seems like you get to acquire them in like rapid succession, which feels a bit weird in hindsight. So I mentioned this earlier that the story's pacing is pretty bad, and I also think that the pacing for progression is a bit off, especially for the first 3 icons. Even though the combat is both fast-paced and visually amazing, it can feel repetitive as the skill tree isn't as expansive as it is with other games. It feels like you're very limited in the way you fight. Obviously, when you have access to all icons, you can mix and match, but even when I had all icons, you can only equip 3, and I feel like it would have been better if you can somehow half-equip a couple, if that makes sense. And especially early game is really bare bones, since Clive's like non-icon abilities are pretty lame, I'm not gonna lie. So it makes the basic sword fighting kind of lackluster. This obviously like resolves once you get your 3rd icon, but it does take a while to get to that point. And again, it makes the combat feel repetitive. The icon fights, however, holy, they are amazing. There were 2 standout fights for me, and like me explaining will not do any justice. And honestly, the less you know, the better your experience will be. It's one of those things that I wish I could forget everything about the game so I could relive that experience again. It's a cinematic masterpiece. The music, the visuals, the choreography of the fight itself, it's just amazing. These icon fights, it's essentially Godzilla vs. King Kong, but with magic. It's really cool, and you don't know what to expect. Logic just goes straight out the window, and you're in for a wild ride. Some of these icon fights can last for 20 plus minutes, and it's just awesome. For me at least, these icon fights were the easiest fights I've ever done, but I was sweating and constantly getting chills. I was fully immersed, and I felt the intensity of the fights. It was to a point where like after I did like 2 of those fights in one sitting, I had to end my stream and just take a break. And it's not because I was stressed out from fighting someone like Melania from Elden Ring or something. It was just purely from the fact of like the atmosphere, the intensity of these icon fights. It's just something that I wish everyone experienced, at least from the demo. Because in the moment, you feel like you can feel the intensity and atmosphere of the fight. But then in hindsight, when you think back on it, you'll be like, wow, that fight was actually like easy and it was like on rails. But I think that's really impressive that they were able to pull it off like that. This makes me wonder if the next iteration will follow 16's success and be another adventure-like entry, or go back to a more traditional RPG, or even a combination of both. My wish is that it will do a combination of both. Take all the good things from 16, the cinematic fights, the intensity, the visuals, and combine them with a more party-focused experience that you see in traditional RPGs. That way, I think when you have a more like party-focused way of storytelling, you can take the time to slow the story down while still having it be meaningful. Because there's a lot of cool characters in Final Fantasy XVI, like Jill and Sid, and a few spoilers. But it would have been cool if there was an option to play as them, or even do like a quest that's specifically focused on them. But hey, if they make another adventure like Final Fantasy XVI, or go back to a traditional Final Fantasy XVI, I won't be upset. I've seen a lot of genre blending in other games, and the Final Fantasy franchise itself is still evolving past its like turn-based past into a modernized like action-based game, but it would be cool to see it evolve even more. Final Fantasy XVI is a great game. It was one of the best experiences I've ever had in a game. The highs of this game is truly outstanding. The visuals, the soundtrack, the atmosphere, the lore, the characters, the dark tone make this a really, really good experience. But these are experience on the highs of this roller coaster. These lows are really slow, boring, and even feel pointless at times. And if it didn't have these insane highs, I would have not enjoyed this game in its entirety. And even if the combat has a slow start and can be repetitive, the abilities you get are visually cool and it feels awesome chaining different abilities at a time. It's an exhilarating experience that I wish I could forget everything and do it all over again. It's that good. It's not the best full rounded experience, especially in terms of pacing, but geez, those high points are really something that I haven't seen in any other game. If you're still on the fence or just want a taste of the experience, the demo is free and is one of the best demos I've ever played as well. I still have to play the DLCs along with this game. Then after that, I can't wait for what direction they decide to do for the next iteration, because it's going to be hard to beat the high points of this game. Thank you for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe to this video if you like this type of content. I'm pretty sure by the time this video is published, I'll be streaming the new Zelda game and reviewing it, which is also a crazy tone shift from Final Fantasy XVI to Zelda, but it is what it is. Leave a comment down below and come join the Discord in the link below that I'm active in. See you guys later.